Ever cut someone off and never looked back? Right, I did, if so.
You know that moment at a family gathering when everyone is talking over each other, the plates are clinking, and it feels like you can almost relax because no one has started their usual drama yet? Well, that was exactly where I was in my head, just trying to get through Sunday lunch without any unnecessary tension, when my younger brother, Mark, leaned back in his chair, smirked at me in that way he does when he's feeling particularly full of himself, and said, "Some people just can't keep up in finance." It wasn't even about the words so much as the tone, that smug delivery that made it sound like he was speaking from some moral high ground he'd earned through years of hard work, when in reality, if you peeled back just one layer of the shiny story he tells people, you'd see my fingerprints all over his so-called career. And before I even had time to come up with a response, because trust me, I had a dozen lined up in my head, my Aunt Carol, who has never been one to let a ridiculous statement pass without poking it, turned to me with her fork halfway to her mouth and asked, completely deadpan, "Is that why your name's on his paycheck?" The sound of the fork in her hand hitting the edge of the plate was nothing compared to the sound of Mark's fork almost hitting the floor as he froze, his eyes snapping to her like she'd just said the one thing no one was ever supposed to say out loud. Now, if you're wondering how we even got to the point where my name would be on his paycheck, that's a story that goes back years, back to when Mark wasn't the polished, confident finance guy he is today, but a 20-something mess who couldn't keep a job for more than 6 months and thought networking was just another word for grabbing drinks with people who could maybe do him a favor. I was already established in the field by then, not at the top, but definitely on my way, and I knew how to manage clients, negotiate contracts, and, most importantly, keep my own books clean. Mark had none of that, but he had charm, and charm is great until the invoices start piling up and the credit card companies start calling. The truth is, when he came to me back then, I didn't see it as bailing him out. I saw it as helping family. He'd gotten himself into a deal he couldn't close, investors were threatening to pull out, and he was on the verge of burning every bridge he had left. I stepped in quietly, took over the accounts, and restructured the whole thing under terms that would keep him from sinking. The deal went through, he got paid, and in exchange, because I wasn't just doing charity work, my name went onto certain agreements as a partner. That meant my name also ended up on certain disbursements, the same ones that feed his lifestyle now. He always pretended like it was just some legal technicality, something that didn't really mean anything, but I knew, and he knew, that without my name there, without my signature, a huge chunk of his so-called empire wouldn't even exist. Over time, I let him take the public credit because it kept the family peace. My parents liked the narrative that their golden boy had made it and that I was the supportive older sister who was happy for him. I played along because I didn't care about the spotlight and, frankly, I had my own work to focus on. But Mark? He loved it. He built his identity around being this self-made success, even though he wasn't self-made at all. And over the years, he got comfortable. Too comfortable. Comfortable enough to forget that there was a reason I never argued when people gave him credit, comfortable enough to believe that I would never cash in the leverage I had, comfortable enough to make a comment like he did at that lunch. When Aunt Carol dropped her little bomb, you could feel the shift at the table. My mother immediately tried to change the subject, my father pretended he hadn't heard, and a couple of cousins just stared down at their plates like the roast chicken had suddenly become fascinating. But I sat there, sipping my drink, watching Mark try to recover, and all I could think was, you really don't get it, do you? Because the truth is, I could have blown up his career any time I wanted. I could have walked into his office with one file folder and ended the whole act in less than an hour. I could have told every investor exactly who had been keeping the machine running all these years. But I didn't. I'd kept that power to myself, not because I was afraid of using it, but because I was waiting for the right moment. And sitting there, watching him squirm while Aunt Carol just raised her eyebrows and waited for an answer he didn't have, I realized that maybe that moment had finally arrived. He'd made it public now. He'd opened the door. And if he thought I was just going to sit there and smile through it, he had no idea what was about to hit him. Because in finance, as in family, timing is everything, and I've always been very, very good with timing. If you've ever been in that position where you're the only adult in a room full of people who think they're adults, you'll understand exactly what it felt like to sit there and let the moment breathe. Because as Mark fumbled with his napkin and tried to laugh like Aunt Carol had made some weird joke, I was already replaying the early years in my head. Those messy months when he kept insisting he was on the verge of something big while I sifted through his binders and found overdue invoices, half-signed engagement letters, and client emails that read like polite pleas for a refund. And I remembered the night he called me past midnight, voice low like a teenager who had dented the family car, telling me he had promised returns he couldn't deliver and that a couple of investors were threatening to bring in an auditor, and how I drove over, sat on his floor, and built a plan that would stabilize cash flow, restructure his obligations, and, most importantly, prevent him from accidentally committing something that would be considered fraud by anyone with a CPA and a conscience. I told him that if I was going to fix it, I needed control in writing, so I drafted a partnership addendum that was not glamorous or theatrical, just precise, where certain revenue streams would be distributed with my name attached, where new accounts would require dual authorization, and where, if thresholds were not met, I could suspend drawdowns until the numbers lined up with reality. And Mark, desperate and grateful and not yet drunk on applause, signed without a second thought, then hugged me like I had pulled him out of a burning building, which, in a way, I had. What people never see in those glow-up stories is the part where someone else organizes the chaos, where someone else knocks on doors and says, "Let me talk to you, because I know what went wrong and I can make it right." So I called 2 clients he had spooked with his bravado. I told them calmly that we were resetting expectations, that I would personally oversee compliance and reporting, that there would be no wild predictions and no corner cutting, and they, being practical and a little relieved, stayed, which gave Mark oxygen, and little by little he started to believe his own hype, and the family leaned into it because it was easier to cheer for a poster child than to admit the scaffolding behind him had my handwriting all over it. Our parents, who love us in that selectively blind way some parents do, took Mark's wins at face value, and every time I tried to express a boundary, my mother would say he needed encouragement, not criticism, and my father would murmur something about potential and momentum, and I got used to swallowing the fact that I was underwriting both. The paperwork that put my name on his paycheck was not a trophy for my ego. It was a seatbelt for a man who treated speed limits like suggestions, and it also happened to be a lifeline for me, because if he ever veered off into the lane marked reckless, I had the ability to hit the brakes without asking anyone's permission, which is exactly why his face went pale when Aunt Carol said what she said, since he understood that the one person at that table with the authority to confirm or deny it was me, and I was not rushing to rescue him from his own mouth. He tried to pivot into a joke about accountants being dramatic and paperwork being boring, and I let him talk, because there is nothing more useful than a liar who fills the silence with words that later sound like admissions when you play them back in your head. The first small move of revenge started in that very moment, not with a slammed door or a shouted accusation, but with a single text reply to a client who had been mine long before Mark learned the difference between revenue and cash. A client who had stayed because I had been steady when Mark had been loud, and who had pinged me under the table just as Aunt Carol asked her question, asking if the rumors about Mark's aggressive posture were true and whether they should be worried about their portfolio exposure, and I, still smiling at my plate, wrote back that I would review allocations personally and that, pending routine compliance checks, certain transfers would be paused until I had verified risk controls, which is the kind of sentence that sounds like a seatbelt but lands like a wall when you are Mark and you think everything is yours to juggle. When lunch dragged into coffee and people started drifting into little side conversations, Mark brushed past my chair and whispered that we needed to talk, claiming that Aunt Carol had misunderstood some internal routing, which was his way of asking me to fix the room without admitting he had broken it, and I told him that if he wanted to talk, we could put a time on the calendar like professionals, because I was done with hallway negotiations and midnight rescues. And I went to the bathroom, looked at my face, and decided I was done being the quiet infrastructure of his myth. On the way back, my phone buzzed again, another message from a different investor, one whose account was technically housed under Mark's book, but sat under my oversight by contract, asking for a call because they had received an invitation to a dinner where Mark would be pitching an expansion strategy that had never crossed my desk. And as I read the message, I felt that clean, calm feeling I get when the numbers finally balance after weeks of work, the feeling that says the next step is obvious, and it will be surgical, not messy. I walked back to the table, thanked my mother for lunch, kissed Aunt Carol on the cheek just to watch Mark flinch, and told everyone I had a few work things to take care of, then stepped outside and called the investor, keeping my voice even as I said that before any expansion talk went out, we would reconcile allocations and reapprove risk, which meant that nothing would move without my signature, because that is what the contract said and that is what the clients expected. And when I hung up, Mark was already texting me something needy and annoyed about loyalty and family and public perception. I did not answer him. Instead, I forwarded the dinner invitation to my own email, flagged 2 accounts for routine verification, and queued a compliance notice that would land on his desk first thing in the morning, and as I put my phone away. The earlier client replied one short line that made my decision lock into place with a click as final as a safe door closing. They were ready to move their account under me directly if I thought it was time. There is a particular kind of work that never makes it into the glossy success stories and certainly never gets posted on social media. The kind of quiet administrative work that looks like nothing from the outside, but feels like standing in a server room flipping the right switches in the right order so the whole building keeps running, and that is exactly what I did the morning after Sunday lunch. Because while Mark sent me a string of messages dripping with that familiar mix of entitlement and panic, I logged into the custodian dashboard, reviewed the agreements that he pretends not to understand, and began with the simplest, least dramatic lever I had, which was a routine compliance attestation that had not been refreshed in a while. A perfectly normal request that required updated signatures from both partners on discretionary accounts, and with that one step I turned a spigot from free flow to slow drip, not to hurt clients, never that, but to make sure every allocation and standing instruction reflected what had actually been approved rather than what Mark had promised during one of his swaggering lunches where he likes to talk about strategy while the check is still on the table. I sent out the attestations with steady, neutral language, the kind auditors love and show to regulators, with a little gold star in the margin. And I included a short line that said that all future transfers would require dual authorization until completion, which meant that the next time Mark tried to push a rebalancing on a hunch, he would be met with a polite request for my signature. And if he wanted it badly enough, he could pick up the phone and justify it like an adult, which I knew he would not enjoy, because the thing about men who build an identity on momentum is that they hate friction that asks questions with dates and amounts. While those notices went out, I checked our limited powers of attorney on 3 accounts that had been added in a rush during his growth spurt 2 years back, the same period when he started believing his own press releases, and I saw exactly what I expected to see, which was sloppy language that could be tightened without drama, so I submitted amendments that did nothing more than align authority with the partnership addendum he signed back when he still understood that I was his seatbelt, and I smiled when the system returned the confirmation because quiet precision is its own kind of victory. By mid-morning, my mother had called twice to ask whether I could please smooth things over with Mark because family is family, and he was just embarrassed, and I told her I was not escalating anything, I was simply doing my job. Which is a sentence that sounds small until you realize it contains the entire boundary I had avoided drawing for years, and after I hung up my father texted me something about keeping appearances for the sake of the extended family, which made me laugh in that tired way you do when you finally understand that people would rather you keep a secret than keep your sanity, so I set the phone face down and kept working. The next lever was the easiest from a legal standpoint and the most annoying from a Mark standpoint. A scheduled reconciliation with the custodian on accounts earmarked for the investor dinner where he planned to pitch expansion. Because you cannot expand something that is out of balance without inviting a very awkward question about controls, and auditors, bless them, love awkward questions that are phrased in calm emails. I drafted a reconciliation request that pulled in settlement records for the last 2 quarters, flagged 2 mismatched timestamps that I knew were basically clerical, and CC'd the risk mailbox, which I knew would put a hold on any presentation materials that reference those accounts until the reconciliation cleared. And it will not shock you to hear that within 20 minutes his assistant messaged me to ask why the slide deck template had vanished from the shared drive, and I replied with a kind of gentle, professional line that tastes like vinegar if you are not used to hearing it, that once reconciliation was complete the materials would be restored in accordance with policy. And if Mark had questions, he was welcome to stop by the risk call at 2 in the afternoon. While I waited for the inevitable call that I knew he would not make, I prepared the move that mattered most to me, which was not public and not dramatic but absolutely final. A tidy packet for 3 clients who had hinted more than once that they would prefer to sit under my direct oversight rather than the hybrid model we had used for years, and I put into those packets the transfer letters, the new fee schedule that rewarded loyalty and maturity, and the clean, respectful rationale that said, our team had evolved and this was the best structure for their goals, because grown adults appreciate being treated like grown adults far more than they appreciate champagne speeches about momentum. I scheduled those packets to send the moment reconciliation opened the gate, and, because I know my brother as well as anyone, I also drafted a short internal notice for operations that clarified who would be the point of contact for those accounts during the transition, which meant that when he tried to stall, he would find that the other departments had already been told, politely, to route around him. Early afternoon brought exactly the storm I had predicted. A one-line text from Mark that said we needed to talk, now followed by a voicemail in which he managed to combine the words loyalty, optics, and betrayal in a way that would have been impressive if it were not so repetitive, and I let both sit while I joined the risk call, answered 2 nerdy questions about settlement lag that probably put half the participants to sleep, and watched as the custodian rep confirmed receipt of our attestation queue and said, with that dry satisfaction only another woman in finance can deliver, that dual authorization would be enforced until the last signature cleared. By late afternoon, the first client wrote back that they appreciated the clarity and were ready to move as soon as we gave the word, and I replied that their timeline would drive ours, which was my way of saying that even if Mark tried to whip up a show at his dinner, the money would already have taken a seat elsewhere. The revenge at the end of that day was not loud. It was a calendar invitation that I sent to the largest investor on Mark's brag list. A private meeting scheduled for the morning after the dinner with a straight subject line that said portfolio governance review and a single sentence in the body that said we will align legal ownership with actual stewardship before any expansion proceeds. And within a minute I saw the acceptance come through with a note that read, we were waiting for you to say when, which would have been satisfying enough, but then a new email landed from the event organizer asking me to confirm my attendance because they had updated the program to include a short segment on compliance leadership, which I had not requested and which could only have happened if someone had whispered the truth in the right ear, and as I stared at the screen I realized the quiet moves were no longer quiet, and the cliff edge that Mark believed was far away was already at his feet. Because when the lights go up at that dinner, the first slide that matters will not be his, it will be mine. By the time Mark finally showed up at my office, which he did without an appointment and with that hurried walk he uses when he wants to look decisive rather than cornered, I had already finished the part that mattered, because the attestations were out. The reconciliations were in motion, the transfer packets were queued, and the calendar invites were accepted, so I let him sit across from me and perform the speech he had rehearsed in his car, the one where he tries to soften his voice and talk about family, legacy, and optics, and I let him run out of words before I slid across the folder he did not expect to see, the one with the partnership addendum he signed when he still needed me, along with the summary page that our counsel had prepared years ago that stated, in plain language even he could not pretend to misunderstand, that discretionary changes, public claims of control, and forward-looking statements were contingent upon dual authorization and factual alignment with legal ownership, which meant that if he went on a stage and sold a story that deviated from those facts, the firm would be exposed in ways that real adults take very seriously. He glanced at the dates, tried to make a joke about ancient history, then realized the addendum had been reaffirmed twice since then, once during the growth spurt he likes to brag about and once after an audit that had kept us out of trouble. And I watched the joke die in his throat as he put his hands on the arms of the chair like he might push himself to standing and escape the conversation altogether. He tried to pivot into threats that were not quite threats, saying that if I continued to undercut him he would take his book of business elsewhere, which would have been adorable if it were not so tedious. Because I had already spoken with our counsel that morning and had confirmed what he has always known in the back of his mind and hated to admit out loud, that the book he thinks of as his is structurally ours, that the accounts carrying his name sit under contracts that require the same dual authorization he was now admitting he could not secure, and that any attempt to move those accounts without my signature would not be a bold entrepreneurial leap but a breach that would set off alarms in places he does not enjoy visiting. I could see him searching for a version of the facts where charm and momentum could get him around a firewall that did not care how well he tells a story, and, because I have a sense of humor even in moments like this, I offered him an out that would have saved his dignity if he had been wise enough to take it, suggesting we co-author his dinner remarks, keep them grounded in what we could prove, and present a united front that would make investors feel secure, and he almost nodded. He almost let common sense win, and then the part of him that needs to be the loudest voice in every room flickered back to life, and he said he would stick to his own script because investors loved his energy and hated footnotes. What he did not know, and what I did not feel obligated to explain because I am done warning a man who treats warnings as invitations, was that I had already contacted the event organizer and the general counsel in the same email, had attached the addendum and the reconciliation notice, and had written a single paragraph that said I would welcome the opportunity to open the program with a brief governance update so that all subsequent remarks could be interpreted in the correct legal context, and because adults who manage real risk appreciate sentences like that, they added me to the agenda and moved my segment to the front half hour, which meant that the first narrative investors would hear would be the one that explained how our firm handles ownership, authorization, and truth. Mark tried to rally by bringing up the family, saying our parents would be mortified if there was a public clash, and for a second I felt that old tug that used to make me mop up his messes, the tug that says keep the peace and you will keep your seat at the table, but then my phone buzzed with a one-line reply from the largest investor on his brag list, confirming our private governance meeting for the morning after the dinner and adding that they were relieved to hear I would be speaking. And the tug evaporated because nothing clarifies priorities like seeing in writing that the adults in the room have been waiting for you to take the wheel. I could have ended the conversation there, but I wanted him to hear the part that would grind at him all afternoon. So I told him plainly that any slide in his deck that referenced accounts subject to reconciliation would be removed by operations until the holds cleared, that any claim of sole control would be struck by counsel to prevent misrepresentation, and that any mention of expansion would be framed as exploratory pending governance review, and he said that sounded like sabotage and I said it sounded like compliance, and we stared at each other across my desk like two people who finally stopped pretending we were on the same side. He played the oldest card he has, asking if I was really prepared to embarrass him in front of clients who had believed in him, and I said I was prepared to tell the truth in front of clients who had believed in us, and I watched him realize that the word us had never meant what he wanted it to mean. When he left, he slammed the door just enough to feel like he had done something, and I let the echo fade while I sent 2 emails that made the rest of the day lock into place like a clean ledger. The first to operations confirming the deck restrictions, and the second to the event organizer attaching a 1-page handout that I asked them to print for each table, a clear, simple sheet that outlined how our firm structures authority, who signs what, and how investors can verify ownership at any time without going through anyone's ego, and it is amazing how quickly a performance collapses when the audience is given a program that tells them which scenes are fiction. The small revenge that ended that day was quiet but surgical, a brief notice to the press liaison who compiles the evening's program notes, asking that my segment be headlined with a phrase that would make every investor sit up before the appetizers arrived. A phrase that said governance ownership update with authorization. Implications, which is dry to most ears, but reads like a fire alarm to anyone who came for a pep rally, and the real cliffhanger, the one I kept to myself as I shut down my computer, was that the handout included a QR code linking to a verification portal branded by the custodian, a portal that, when scanned, would display the names on the accounts exactly as they are. And since those names include mine in places Mark has been pretending they do not, the moment he steps up to the microphone and tries to sell a legend, a dozen phones will already be telling the truth out loud. I knew the evening would not be about speeches or canapes or whatever performance Mark had imagined in his head. I knew it would be about whether adults who manage real money prefer noise or clarity when someone finally puts the facts on a single page. So when the event organizer opened with a polite welcome and then introduced me with that dry title about governance and authorization that makes salespeople sweat and compliance officers sit up, I took the microphone like it was any ordinary staff meeting. I thanked the room for trusting the firm with their accounts, and I said, in a voice that carried without trying, that before anyone pitched strategy, it would be responsible to align what was being said from the stage with what was true in the documents. Because grown investors appreciate alignment more than they appreciate enthusiasm, and heads nodded in the way heads nod when people recognize their own values being mirrored back at them without flattery. I did not drag Mark or tell war stories or even mention family. I simply explained how discretionary authority works in our shop, how dual authorization protects both sides from sloppy promises, how ownership appears on custodian records, and how every person in the room could verify those records in less than a minute. And then I told them about the one-page handout on their tables and the code that would take them directly to the portal where their accounts live, and I stepped back, not for drama, but to give them a moment to do what adults do when handed a clear tool. And you could hear the quiet shift as screens lit up and people read silently, the way they do when the facts on the phone are louder than any story from a stage. Mark, to his credit, or maybe to his reflex, tried to walk out as if nothing had happened. He lifted his hands and thanked me for the informative update and said he would now move into the exciting part. The plan to expand a product line that sounded bold when you said it quickly, and he started his first slide, which had been trimmed by operations to remove the accounts under reconciliation, and the language council had redlined. And I watched him register the cuts in real time, because the slide looked naked without the thunder he had planned, and before he could recover, someone near the front raised a hand and asked, not unkindly, whether the accounts being referenced were the very ones showing dual authority under my name. And Mark said something about internal structure, the way he always does when the truth feels inconvenient, and another investor said they appreciated clarity and wondered aloud whether the expansion would proceed under my oversight if the majority of the underlying contracts required my signature. And he tried to pivot to relationships and momentum, and a third voice, this one familiar because it belonged to the largest investor on his brag list, said the obvious thing, that governance is not a mood, and that if my name is on the authorization line, then any expansion conversation is premature without me in the driver's seat. I let him speak until the room started tightening around him, not out of cruelty but out of a decision I should have made years ago, and then I stood without touching the microphone and said I would keep it simple. I said we had completed the internal checks that morning and that a small number of clients had requested a structure that placed them directly under my stewardship rather than the hybrid model we had been using, and that in response I had agreed to honor those requests in a way that preserved stability and reduced their fees, because that is what responsible firms do when clients ask for less noise and more accountability. And then I told them that transfers would begin at the opening bell, and that operations had already been instructed where to route questions, which meant there would be no gaps and no theatrics, only continuity with a different name at the top of the page. It was not a threat, and it was not a humiliation. It was a set of adult sentences spoken in a room of adults who understood exactly what they meant, and in the pause that followed, the organizer glanced at me and then at Mark, and I could see him understand that the center of gravity had moved without a fight. Mark asked for a private word the way a drowning man asks for a towel, loudly and with indignation, and I told him we could speak after the program like professionals, because I was not going to turn a room of clients into an audience for a sibling quarrel. And then I closed my part with one more line that I had written 3 times until it sounded like a lock sliding into place. I said that the firm would continue to be transparent about who holds authority on which accounts and that any future claims of sole control would be accompanied by documents, not adjectives, and people did that little tap on the table that stands in for applause when they want to keep things dignified, and I sat down knowing the evening had already finished, no matter how many slides remained. He stumbled through a shorter version of his talk. He skipped the parts that counsel had gutted, and when he finally put the microphone down and tried again to square up to me, the organizer intercepted him with a polite note about the next segment, which was not an accident, because I had sent a copy of our addendum and my handout to the venue staff earlier that day with a request for a smooth program, and smooth programs do not include hallway theatrics. The last act did not look like a victory lap. It looked like a quiet walk to the exit while phones buzzed with confirmations. Because as people left their tables, they stopped to say they appreciated the clarity and that they would see me at the governance meeting in the morning, and one of them, the one who had waited the longest for me to step forward, leaned in and said something I will remember whenever I doubt my timing. He said that what I had done was not flashy, but it was final, and that the rooms that matter prefer final to flashy every single time. I passed the press liaison who asked for a comment for the program notes, and I gave her a single sentence about alignment and client priorities, because there was nothing else to say. And then I walked to the curb and let the evening air cool the part of me that still shakes after hard choices, and I looked at my phone and saw the first transfer confirmed, then the second, then the third, and I felt the old tug toward guilt try to whisper that I had broken something, which I answered with the simple truth that I had finally stopped breaking myself to keep someone else's act intact. Later there will be family calls and likely some performance about loyalty and appearances. Later there will be the messy business of separating what is ours from what is his. And maybe there will be a question I cannot answer about when exactly I decided to stop being the seatbelt and start being the driver. But tonight did not need those answers. Tonight needed a single clean move that would stand when the noise died down, and I made it. And it held, and as I rode away I did not feel triumphant so much as steady, which, after years of carrying a story that was not mine, feels like the kind of victory that lasts.